Hello, and welcome to Fort Vancouver Regional Library's 2024 Revolutionary Reads series. This year's series focused on the book Free: 2 Years, 6 Lives, and the Long Journey Home by Lauren Kessler. This year's program was built in partnership with our community organization, the Foundation, Restore and Prepare, and is made possible through generous support by the FVRL Foundation. Thank you for your interest in this program, and as always, thank you for using your public library.
Revolutionary Reads is an annual community reads program with the goal of galvanizing the Southwest Washington community to read the same book on a topic of revolutionary importance. Revolutionary is defined as involving or causing a complete and dramatic change, and or radically new or innovative, outside or beyond established procedure, principles, etc. The 2024 program focuses on the experience of incarceration and reentry. This series will explore the challenges, systems, and supports that exist in Southwest Washington for those returning home. This program speaker is Emarina Daniels. Emarina is a master educator, field researcher, and public scholar at the intersection of education, corrections, criminal legal reform, and of abolition. They're compelled to ground their work in what they hear from community groups and impacted people and families, learning also from thinkers, activists, mystics, practitioners, and healers. Their formal education includes a Master's of Science in Teaching from Portland State University and a Bachelor of Arts in Communications from the University of North Carolina, Charlotte. Emarina has been studying and exploring barriers to learning and what it means to be a better teacher for over 25 years. Their first text, Building a Trauma-Responsive Educational Practice, Lessons from a Corrections Classroom, is the first book to address the impacts of trauma on adult learning and provide a guide to working in carceral spaces. The text also invites curiosity about how we can bring joy into challenging spaces, especially carceral classrooms, and what that can mean for learners. Emarina focuses on countering the impacts of trauma on learning as a way to guide students toward rediscovering themselves as strong and capable learners, and one pathway to a joyful and compassionate world.
This presentation is a new one for me. I talked about the School-to-Prison pipeline for a long, long time, and I've worked in corrections, I've worked in reentry, and I've been interested in reform around these areas of reform as possible for many years. But I haven't talked about the School-to-Prison pipeline in quite this way. So my hope for tonight is that you'll leave with a better understanding of what actually happens, not just a collection of facts and data points, because that's what a lot of these presentations are. And that can be really useful for some people and for some reasons, but I think when we're just at the very beginning of our learning, it's maybe less helpful. So we're going to spend some more time talking about systems and relationships and how they change and what we can do to help those changes happen. And in order to do that, we are going to be tackling some big concepts, including what we think are the purposes of education and discipline. And we may not end up in agreement, but we should be able to come to some understanding of ourselves and the other people in this group. So this is our first breakout session. This is where we're going to sort of put our minds in with a bunch of other people. And these are what we're going to talk about. What is the purpose of education? And then in that context, what is the purpose of discipline? So the four people here are going to talk together, and then we're going to I think all the folks online can probably be in their own breakout room online. And we'll come back in 15 minutes and then we'll do a little debrief and see what people came up with. Okay. So I think I made the questions really large because we have so many different ideas about it. It's very difficult, like even with people who were interested enough in the topic to come at 6 o'clock in the evening, in the middle of the week, there's just not enough time to really talk about like what all these things mean. So at least we have a little bit of starting points in terms of like education is about structuring guidelines, some experience with other people, and sets a foundation for something, which is fine. It can be a foundation for many things. And then discipline, we're looking at controlling the environment, controlling the situation. It seems to be more about the adult and the teacher, and then maybe teaching students some self-discipline. And then the question of the police and law enforcement, which we'll talk about a little bit more later. So, all right, we're gonna move on to this next piece. So I always think that it's really helpful whenever I'm doing presentations to let people know sort of where I'm starting in the presentation, because this isn't really, it's an introduction workshop, but it's not an introductory topic so much, because it just involves a lot of things. So my first point is that organized education is different than learning. So humans are learning beings. We learn, doesn't matter if we're organized or not, we're going to be learning. And organized education is this formal system that we've created to sort of standardize both what we learn and then how we learn it. And it's where we're assimilated into our societies and our cultures. Primary and secondary schools, and this is in the US, but I think there's rough equivalents in most countries. But primary and secondary schools are where we're sent to learn like some shared body of knowledge, whatever that is going to be, and then like who we are in public spaces. There's this invisible curriculum that tells us who we are, how we can expect to be treated, and how we should treat others in our environment in public spaces. And that is part of what we learn in school, whether that is a conscious intention of the teacher or not. So my second starting point is that systemic, structural, historical, and individual racism and ableism are real, and they have measurable impacts on the health and well-being of millions of people. Third, organized education sits at a point of intersection with almost every public social system we have created in the United States. One of those intersections is with the criminal legal system, and on the other side of that intersection is mass incarceration. The point of intersection for education and the criminal legal system is inequitable and discriminatory school disciplinary practices and choices, and these disproportionately impact Black and Brown and disabled students. So this conversation, like any conversation about the school-to-prison pipeline, can be really overwhelming because there's so many factors to consider. Not every child who is disciplined ends up in jail or prison, and not everyone who's in jail or prison was disciplined in school. But the data show really strong connections across time between school discipline, contact with the criminal legal system, and eventual incarceration, especially for people of color and people with disabilities. And what we're doing today is talking about, like, what does that all mean for us as individuals? What agency do we have to make change? And what do we think that change might accomplish? So next, and we're just going to talk about this sort of as a group, but what do we expect from schools? Like, we kind of have some stuff around what we expect from education and what is the purpose of education, but what do we actually expect from schools? Yeah, there's a lot that you can unpack there, which is, I think it's also really important, like with all of these things, that it's not about the intention of the school. Teachers don't go in with the intention of, like, I'm not going to acknowledge that child needs something different, or I'm not going to acknowledge that people want to do these things, but the number of competing interests, I think it's important. And even though intention and impact are different things and you have to talk about them both, I think it is really, like, in this period of time when teachers are really, really just being so disrespected and so denigrated and so sort of just, I don't know, it's like people just want to set them on fire in the public square. I think it's just really important to acknowledge that most people go into teaching because they really care about kids and they care about learning. So this question comes up, like, why are we even talking about all of this in the context of the school-to-prison pipeline? Why does it even matter? And my thinking on this is that the impacts of the school-to-prison pipeline, or the education-to-prison nexus, and we'll talk a little bit about the sort of difference of language there, are wide-ranging. But for our purposes today, I think talking about sort of two things is really important. So one, teachers and students and communities, when we're looking at this in the perspective of the school-to-prison pipeline, they're denied the opportunity to learn freely without fear of retaliation or punishment. They're expected to focus on obedience and control rather than developing these healthy and nurturing relationships that we have to have for off-school learning. So when you look at the requirements of learning and how people learn really well, it's kind of the opposite of what is happening in our schools. And so as a result of all of the things that cause that, education is being transformed from this institution that we all sort of in an ideal world think is devoted to child development and learning. And it's moving towards one that is really focused more and more on control, on deterrence, on punishment. And as children become adults, that culture of control, deterrence, and fear and punishment permeates our society and our culture. So this has been happening for decades now. And so we become more and more fearful, we demand more and more control, and this all inevitably leads to harsher and harsher punishments when people feel out of control. So these impacts have been accumulating for a long time, and if we don't start to do something to address them, like it's a really bleak thought of like what is happening to our country. Like if we're only taught to fear other people, any other people, and protect ourselves at any cost, like what kind of world is that? And so that may seem like a really big thing to talk about, like what kind of world are we creating? But literally, this is what we talk about right here. Like that's what's happening in school, and where children are taught to fear anybody and everything all the time. Then that's the kind of world that we're creating, because they are going to grow up to be adults, and they're going to just carry that with them. So before we move a little more into like sort of the problem of the pipeline, we're going to look a little bit at systems and change. So having some understanding of the difference between an individual and a system is pretty important, and knowing that difference like matters in this conversation particularly because mass incarceration and the education prison nexus are racialized, ableized institutions. And the people in this room and online may already have some understanding around this, but for people who don't, this will at least give us a sense of where we're starting. So these kinds of conversations, like having conversations about race and ableism, can be really fraught, and there are a lot of reasons for that. But I think one of the main reasons is that people don't want to think that way of themselves. And when we talk about racism and ableism and who benefits from those systems and who is harmed, like people don't even want to consider that they might benefit from such a clearly terrible thing. Like none of us want to think that as individual people, we benefit from something that is so clearly hurting other people. The thought is sort of intolerable. And the conversation rapidly becomes about who is a bad person. And we completely never even get to, this is a systemic issue, and maybe you have some individual stuff to work on, and here's that way as we never even get to that conversation because we're so busy having a fight over who is a bad person and who isn't a bad person. So we can't talk about these kinds of difficult topics, like these systems of ableism and racism. It is almost impossible for us to even understand what, not only what needs to change, but even what could change. And so are people as individuals racist and prone to racist, ableist behavior? I mean, sure we are. Sure. We all are. We all live in a lot of different intersections. We all can do some of these things individually. We've internalized some of it. Like we all can cause harm in one direction or another. That is all true. But with very rare exceptions, an individual person does not have the power to send millions of people to prison. But what does have the power to send millions of people to prison is a system or several systems that are acting together. And we all have a part in creating and maintaining the wide variety of systems, some that are helpful and some that are not. So how does this happen? Well, over time, people create systems to organize and streamline whatever it is they're doing. If you're making donuts, you want to make more donuts because that's in the US, that's what we would do. You make more donuts. And so you're going to find some way to make more donuts and make it faster. Hopefully they're still going to be delicious. I mean, not always, but we're going to hope that your donuts are mostly delicious. And you're going to create a system to do that. So that donut making system is really devised out of your mind, and it comes from your perspective and your thinking and your biases. So if you don't like chocolate donuts, or if you don't like chocolate filled donuts, you're going to build a donut production line that doesn't have an option for putting chocolate filling in donuts. So for those of us who desperately need chocolate filled donuts in order to have a good quality of life, or we are being harmed by the lack of chocolate-filled donuts, this is a problem. This is a ridiculous example, by the way. I'm making it up as we go. But the lack of chocolate-filled donuts is problematic. And so we come to you and we say, we really need chocolate-filled donuts. And you're like, chocolate-filled donuts are not a thing, and they don't even exist. So there's no possible way that my system could ever make them. So when we start to think about like, what does systemic change look like? We're up against that idea of like, well, if chocolate-filled donuts don't exist, then how can I be responsible for you not having them? So it becomes this sort of game that we play with each other. And why that matters is because a lot of people are being hurt by you not having chocolate-filled donuts. So I need you to go get on some chocolate-filled donuts. So although I love that example because it's so ridiculous.
It's good.
But it's a good example because donut making is, it's a system. So although systems are made up of individual people, it takes more than one person changing their mind. So if you now have a national chain of donuts and of donut making apparati, and none of it offers chocolate-filled donuts, then you just deciding that this one Vancouver location needs to have chocolate-filled donuts is maybe going to be a problem because one person can't really change the entire way that a system functions. Systemic change is really hard. It takes a lot of people changing themselves and then figuring out how to apply that change and then doing it day after day after day. So it's not just a moment of changing your mind. It's a moment of figuring out how does this change in my thinking apply in my daily life, and then how do I practice that all the time, and how does that show up in the world? So there's like this whole process that has to happen. So just because you decide you want to offer chocolate-filled donuts, you changed your mind. You're like, oh my God, chocolate-filled donuts exist. They're a thing, and now I want to have them. Like, unless you do more, just you having that realization doesn't do anybody any good. I mean, you can sympathize with those of us who need chocolate-filled donuts, but it doesn't do anybody any good. So systemic change usually takes a lot longer than we prefer, but that immediate sort of drastic change that we can actually sustain is really rare. Like, we're really adaptable, but we have taught ourselves to resist change in some very, very innovative ways. Like, we are very resistant to change. As adaptable as we are very resistant to change. So an example that I was thinking about was if you have a principal at a school who is interested in equitable discipline policies. And so you have this person, and I don't know what's happening at the school system level, at the sort of district level. Maybe they leave it up to the principal. And so this principal's like, okay, we're going to do this. I'm going to put money into this, resources. We're going to bring in trainers. We're going to get our teachers trained. We're going to do X, Y, Z, and all this stuff. So that's wonderful. And then Principal A leaves. So Principal B comes in, and Principal B doesn't have the same approach, doesn't have the same interest, doesn't have the same background. And they're like, this is taking a lot of money and a lot of time, and I'm getting pressured for budget cuts, so I don't see why this is necessary. And Principal B is like, whoosh. And so that whole thing gets cut. Well, the individual people who were part of that program might decide they want to continue doing these things in their own classrooms, and maybe they sort of talk to each other, and there's a little bit of it, but it's really kind of limping along. And while they can, like, the students in their classrooms might have some different experience around discipline, as a school broadly, we go back to those old harsh policies. So Principal A's influence is individual. And so even though they have a lot of influence over that one school, it didn't really do anything around the larger systemic change. And the principal may not have been able to impact the actual sort of policies and rules and maybe even laws and external relationships and resources that are deeply embedded in these inequitable policies. So they were able to sort of duck and dodge those while they were there, but the minute they leave, all of that stuff is still in place because it wasn't ever really changed. So we normally talk about the sort of connection between education and prison as the pipeline, and it's a really great visual. It's really easy for people to understand, but it is so much more complicated than a pipeline. That when I found that people were using the term nexus, I thought, okay, well, that's a little bit more nuance. Like, it has a little bit more nuance, a little bit more complexity. I'm not sure that it's as clear a visual. So I've been playing around with it, but we're going to use that some tonight and kind of see how that goes. So some observations that I have about the nexus are, like, going to jail or prison is rarely an immediate consequence, but it is more often a distributed phenomenon that occurs across time. So there's rarely like one thing that you can look at as the sole reason for incarceration. It's usually a whole bunch of things, not even necessarily criminal things, but there's like a whole lot of stuff that happens to somebody's life. So it's a very sort of complex journey. What happens in the education to prison nexus happens inside a network and context of relationships. And schools are where, as we have talked about, are where we learn how to conduct ourselves and who we can or can't be in these public relationships. And this happens in a lot of ways. So teachers who make eye contact with who is the teacher looking at? Who is the teacher like sort of acknowledging in the classroom? Whose answers in class get applauded? Whose answers do not? Who gets called on, who doesn't get called on, who gets reprimanded, what are they getting reprimanded for, are other people's behavior getting overlooked, who's getting sent to the principal's office, who isn't. Like, all of these things tell us how we can be in public and how people are going to treat us in public and how we're supposed to treat other people in public. So from personal experience, if for no other way, we know that adults wield enormous power in adult-child relationships. And this is even more true of teachers. So people are rarely going to remember the chemistry test from 10th grade, but they're absolutely going to remember that that chemistry teacher either praised them or punished them, made them feel really capable and really smart, or made them feel worthless and incompetent. And then the last observation is systems are built on transactions. So you do this, I give you that. You fill out this form, I give you this license, you pass a test, the system gives you a diploma. Those are all transactions. So there's no built-in room for anything else. In fact, anything else is often viewed with suspicion in this country. Is that person playing favorites? Is that teacher giving that person more than they gave my person? You know, is somebody getting something shady happening over there? Like, there's a lot of suspicion if you try to do anything that isn't transactional. But humans don't relate solely through transactions. Our relations are more complex and nuanced, especially if we're trying to figure out what's happening with the other person so we can feel more connected to each other. But those transaction-focused relationships don't allow for complexity or nuance. The why is less important than the what, although the why is profoundly important when people, especially children, behave in ways that are considered socially unacceptable. And I think you were talking about this a little earlier, like developmentally, you know, how children are acting, like we've criminalized that behavior, just normal development behavior. Okay, so we're gonna do another like small group discussion for about 10 minutes. Would y'all like to just do this all together since we have just a few people? Our online folks, would you be willing, can we do this together?
I'd actually prefer that so I can hear from everyone.
Okay, well, let's do that. All right, well, let's just talk about this. What do we know about this nexus or the pipeline? What have we heard? What have we experienced? What have you observed or learned? What do we say? Who would like to give us a start? Who gets to feel safe? You know, who physically is safe? Mm-hmm. And those are really hard questions. Like, those are hard conversations to have because honestly, right now, very few people feel safe. And so it's really hard to get past that initial, well, I don't feel safe either, to get to this conversation of agreed, we are all feeling bad. Like, it's a bad time in the world right now. And we have people who are not just like not feeling safe, they are being actively hurt. And so it's hard to get to that part of it because everybody feels like really anxious and vulnerable and nervous and scared. And it's very hard to get through that sometimes. So we're just gonna look, these are the elements of the nexus. And we've talked about a number of these, not in this sort of level of detail, but we've talked about all of them, except for zero tolerance policies. But we have even kind of talked about those. Like for me, if that kid came in with a weapon, I would be like, okay, something is wrong, like very wrong. And can we have that conversation without having to involve the criminal legal system right out of the gate? And the answer right now is no, definitely not. You cannot even have that conversation with the child and their family for some very good reasons, because very bad things have happened at school. But if this child has not done anything like this before, and they like, what kind of conversation could we have that isn't immediately referring them for criminal charges? And then we talked a little bit about this, major trends. These are, yeah, so these trends are really just sort of what's been happening over the last 10 or 15 years. And I'm wondering, like, what do you see in these? What are themes? Anything here? Like, what is the theme that we're seeing here? Are there themes?
Or violence in a place that shouldn't have violence.
Okay. So violence, I think attempts to control violence, you know, but it's controlling violence with more violence.
Yeah.
I mean, we know that police are trained in some very specific ways. And so they're in this country, you know, I'm going to say systemically, because you can have individual people who do have a skill set around de-escalation and, you know, centering care. You can totally have individual people, but systemically, that is not the way that our law enforcement officers are trained. Did I see anybody online who wanted to hop in here?
I would say I was going to agree with the control, but just in general, just more control, structure, discipline, very military-based kind of structure.
Yeah. And that seems to me to not be, like, given the just staggering amount of change we've all been experiencing over probably the last 15 or 20 years. I mean, if you think about it, that should be a surprising response, like attempts to control more. So I don't know that that there's malice behind that, but the way that it plays out is, I think, really harmful. Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, people have not had the platform for voice. Black people, disabled people, brown people, immigrants, all of these marginalized communities have not had the sort of sheer, well, I would say volume. Like, they have not been able to get their voices out in the same way. And so people being able to say, well, this has been basically our experience in school all the time. We have never been the ones who have been able to feel safe. We've never been the ones who have been protected. And, you know, and the response to that is, well, we don't feel safe either. And so that becomes a very complicated conversation. It becomes a very difficult conversation. And I think that that's right. I think that some of this attempt to control is coming in response to people finally being able to say, well, hey, this has not been the beautiful walk through an English garden that everybody might want to think that it was. So one of the questions that I think is really important, like, we all assume that discipline is part of the problem of the pipeline of Nexus. Discipline is problem, and our data kind of show it, but, like, why is it? Why is that the case? So as I was thinking about this, I think a lot about language, because it's really, we can't beam our thoughts to each other. We're not telepathic. You know, it's one of our, you know, it is both a blessing and maybe the single largest barrier is, like, trying to communicate with each other is very challenging. So language becomes very important. And I have wondered if we are just confusing discipline with punishment, and not just in our language, but in our actions, but we are lying to ourselves and we are not willing to just say it. So in an article in Edutopia on their website, there's a note that discipline, unlike punishment, is proactive and begins before there are problems. It means seeing conflict as an opportunity to problem solve. Discipline provides guidance, focuses on prevention, enhances communication, models respect, and embraces natural consequences. It teaches fairness, responsibility, life skills, and problem solving. So according to the Britannica website, punishment is the infliction of some kind of pain or loss upon a person for a misdeed, i.e. the transgression of a law or a command. The rest of the definition was terrible, so I'm not gonna, don't have it on the paper. It was really bad. I mean, it was like rapidly describing what punishment used to be, like flogging or some, I don't even know. It was very terrible. So that definition is not anything I would want to have happen to a child. I wouldn't want to have it happen to adults. I don't want that. So I think that we've done this. So when you put those two definitions side by side, it seems really clear to me that school discipline is really more about punishment and not really so much about discipline. And I know I would much rather be talking about discipline here than punishment. I would much rather be talking about that. But when we look at some of the elements of the nexus, maybe it will clarify for us a little bit more sort of how we, I don't know how we got here. Well, yeah, I do. Racism. I mean, racism and ableism is really, I mean, those are really the answers. You know, the school-to-prison pipeline grew out of a school system that in many ways was designed to exclude anybody who didn't fit this very narrow definition of what a student should be. And when people started to access the system anyway, when they were able to sort of make themselves conform and they were able to be successful, schools started clamping down more and more and more. And this, again, people don't really want to talk about that, but that is just like we don't want to talk about the evolution of the police who came up as slave catchers. Like that is the evolution of modern day policing. And we don't really want to talk about that because that's a conversation that people just do not want to have. Nobody wants to believe that they are part of that. Nobody wants to believe that about themselves. So it becomes very difficult to talk about. So in almost any research on the education to prison nexus, racial disparities in discipline practice is the #1 reason for suspensions and expulsions of students of color, and students with disabilities are also disproportionately impacted. These data have not changed significantly in the last 15 years, according to current reporting from the U.S. News and World Report, the Journal of Criminology, and the Learning Policy Institute, and about 3 million pages of other articles and videos and any kinds of books and whatnot. So we're not lacking for data to tell us that there are deep inequities in discipline that are based on race and ability. So how do these punitive disciplinary practices and racial and ability disparities in who gets disciplined connect to mass incarceration? So that's a connection that does not really always get made. It's sort of an invisible thing. So I put together this chart to try to visualize what happens, and not only that, to sort of track across all three of these systems how they reinforce each other, how the criminal legal system enforces what has been happening in K through 12. And then when you get to corrections, that's sort of the ultimate level of enforcement of something that started way back for some kids, sometimes as early as ages 4 and 5. So that system, the criminal legal system, includes law enforcement, which houses school resource officers and school police officers. So even if they're employees of the school district or the school, their training and focuses on law enforcement and deterrence, not development and learning. So some things we know about having law enforcement presence in schools. There is a lack of evidence that stationing police in schools makes schools safer. I'm just going to say Uvalde. That was, like, if there was ever an example of how law enforcement are not making schools safer, like Uvalde is like the answer to that. Increased school policing may have negative impacts, including expanded involvement in incidents that might better be handled in other ways, and criminalization of school discipline. Districts do and this is really important, districts do a poor job of monitoring the consequences and aftermath of police involvement. They just leave it up to the criminal legal system, and there's not really a lot of follow through on what happens and how does a student come back into school. Like, does the school just abdicate all of its responsibility once that happens? Because that's pretty terrifying. It is not just about arrests. Police engage in other activities, such as issuing summary citations, which may have long-term consequences. Because sometimes, depending on how the police issue like citations and things like that, maybe it stays on somebody's record, maybe it gets whacked when they're 18, but there's a lot of like fuzziness in there too. So if they're issuing something that doesn't really fall under whatever category of things that gets erased, then somebody may end up with a thing on their record for when they were 12. Insufficient oversight. And this is connected to a poor job of monitoring, but it's a separate issue. It's formal guidelines. So formal guidelines are lacking, especially when it comes to specific prohibitions on police involvement with specific types of incidents and restrictions on student searches. So the student resource officer programs raise constitutional concerns about interrogations, searches without proper justification, and other things. And they also, as we've already said, can lead to escalation, incident escalations. So I thought it would be interesting to see what's going on locally in the Vancouver School District. Yeah, well, the answer is we don't know, because they have made that information available to us. In 2019, the Vancouver School District received a memo from the state AG's office addressing severe inequities in its disciplinary policies towards students of color and students with disabilities. As of April 2024, there are no follow-up data or statistics available either via the BSD website or outside reporting that I could find. BSD did commission a report from the Center for Civil Rights Remedies about inequities in disciplinary practice, but they have not posted the full report, only a list of unverified recommendations. BSD has posted a full report from an equity audit, I think completed in 2021, but discipline is only mentioned in a passage confirming the findings of the AG's office. There's no public information about BSD disciplinary statistics or information about rates of suspension or expulsion that I could find. Vancouver School District scorecards are only available for 2018 to 2019 and do not contain demographic data on disciplinary practice, suspensions, or expulsions, and I could not find data more recent than the 2018-2019 school year. And my email to the Director of Equity for a copy of the full inequitable discipline report and any other findings from the Discipline Equity Committee has not received a response as of April 10th, 2024. But you've now had a minimum of 2 years to get your data together. And you can even say, well, we're going to do this with a caveat that COVID happened, and so some of this may or may not be as reliable. Like, you can do a bunch of ways to share what you find and let people know, like, we're not real sure like how this is going to track, et cetera, et cetera. So what is interesting about this is, like, in this area, in Vancouver School District, the Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander students are at higher risk. The Evergreen I didn't look at. So, you know, it's different. Like, when I was living in Spokane, it was Indigenous students and Black students had the highest incidence, especially compared to the population. It's nuts. You're 2% of the population, 13%. So I think that, you know, when we look at this, like, what we don't have, because none of these systems really talk to each other. The school kind of talks to the criminal legal system, but it doesn't talk to the prison. Prisons don't collect data about what high school people went to. So you can't make the connection that says Vancouver School District is disproportionately sending people to prison. Like, you can't make that kind of connection. So it makes it, again, one of those more difficult things to talk about, because people are like, well, what are your data? I'm like, well, what we're going to see is I'm going to show you educational demographics of people who are incarcerated. So we can see like the ends, but sort of how somebody gets there and like what role education plays in the middle is all like very fuzzy. So that's also important for us to know. And this is how systems protect themselves. They make it almost impossible for you to know what's actually happening. So we can talk about, like, on an individual level, like this kid, right? We'll just call them Jay. So we'll call this kid Jay. So we could say, like, we have this one kid, we can sort of follow like what happens to them. And this was a catastrophic event, right? They are in a position where it seems likely that they are going to end up in some kind of incarceration for some amount of time. That's not normally what happens. You know, I don't know what this kid's history is. Maybe there's some other stuff that happened in the background, like maybe there's some other thing. I don't have any idea. I don't even assume that that's true. I'm just saying, you know, we don't know. But this is a catastrophic sort of go directly to prison from school. That's not really normally what happens, but it's very difficult for us to say because schools don't do their job of when a student gets involved with when they send these students into the criminal legal system, they aren't really following up to figure out what's happening. Nobody does. Everybody's just like, oh, they're gone. Not our problem anymore. Like they're out of here. We don't have to account for them anymore. There's just no data around that. I think that when I hear this, like the first step is forcing them to collect data. Well, there's a data collection piece, but there's also like the school needs to not just abdicate responsibility for these kids. So that's part of this is like, how do we, it's not the prison pipeline piece where that's the school's responsibility. The school's responsibility is the handoff or the kick out to the criminal legal system. They're like, we can't deal with them anymore, turn them over to the police. And that is where, so even if they have a thing and something happens, then the kid is just wandering around. Like whose job is it to bring them back? Probably DCYF, right? Something like that, not the school. That police over the last probably 50 years have become increasingly more militarized because they are getting huge pots of funding from the federal government they're getting huge pots of resources in military grade weaponry that basically the military is unloading and they write grants and then they get a bunch of this sort of military grade weaponry. And they're also getting paid a lot of money to take certain kinds of training. Like that's how they get their funding is they're getting training around all of these sort of military grade weapons and things like that. So when you look at like how they can get money for bringing in some of this stuff. So part of that money goes to the metal detectors, you know, or whatever that is. And then they might have some other money that can also go to other things that can qualify as safety measures, but it's not going to music programs, it's not going to art programs, it's not going to, you know, physical recreation and things like that. It's all going towards more of this sort of command and control sort of militarization. And that stuff doesn't leave us just because we graduate high school. Like we internalize that. And we're more accepting of it and more open to it as we become adults. So we don't think anything about the, you know, police running around with literally military grade, like automatic weapons or semi-automatic weapons. Like we don't even question that. We're like, oh, sure, like we've seen that. And some of this we've already talked about. So we talked about these sort of unintended outcomes. And I think let's look at these pre-incarceration. So these are educational backgrounds and demographics from people. These data are like 25 years old, but there has not been another report done that's as comprehensive, and I don't think they changed that much. So these are some of the statistics for people who are incarcerated, and this is local, state, and federal facilities. So these are just educational attainment, and this was done by the Bureau of Justice Statistics. And then these are, I think, two things that are really striking to me. So, well, I should make a note. I'm using the language of the report. Like I normally would not use the word inmate because it's really dehumanizing language. And the Underground Scholars Language Guide, which is a guide communicating about people in the carceral system, and Eddie Ellis both do work around that. So if people are interested in that language, you can look up either one of those things. But just because it's it's literally what the report says. So the for-profit GED, so GED was not a for-profit credential until 2014, and then it was taken over and it was turned into a for-profit business, and it became sort of the sole high school credential offered in most prisons. So we are paying for children to be in school. We are putting all that money into them, and then they are diverted out of the system, and then we have to pay again. And people shouldn't have to go to prison to get an education. You know, there's a whole conversation around why do people get a free education? Why don't I get a free education? I'm like, we should all get free educations, and you shouldn't have to go to prison to get it. So that's really important. Like that particular piece of it is really important. But, you know, part of this is like when people complete a GED when they're in prison, that's not learning. What they're doing is they're figuring out how to pass a test so they get the credential they need. So if they're lucky, they can go on and get some college classes. And that doesn't mean GED teachers don't work hard. I've seen GED teachers and ABE teachers who, hands down, some of the best teachers I have ever seen. But I've also seen people who basically hand someone a paper packet and that's the extent of the work they do. So it is, the fact that this is what people are having to do is really, it's very upsetting. It's upsetting to me. So here's our demographic information. 66% of people, learning disabilities. How many percent of that do you think is diagnosed? Like 1%, 2% maybe? This doesn't list TBIs, but traumatic brain injuries serve in a lot of ways, like learning disabilities and other kinds of like sort of behavioral indicators. And the reporting is anywhere from like 30 to 80% of people in prison could have DBIs. In the general population, non-incarcerated population, that number is 10% or under. So when you think about like the incidence of traumatic brain injuries when people like sort of on the path of prison, it's remarkable to me.
And anecdotally, the school district and the schools know very little about what qualifies even as a TBI.
As a TBI. And then,
My daughter
let alone
had a
learning disabilities, like there's all kinds of barriers to getting diagnosed with learning disability, and mainly money, right? Like they're very expensive. It's $2,000 or $3,000 diagnostic to get you know, a diagnosis around that.
Yeah.
And then learning related harm, and we're 2 minutes over. I'm gonna just say this really quickly. Like this is my sort of area of interest and expertise. Is like, how do we look at harm reduction in the classroom? What does learning related harm mean? What does it do? And I just think this is it right here. People give up. They're told that they're wrong. They're told that they're bad. You're told, like, so in our country, if you can't do something the way that people say you have to do it, it's not just like you need to learn it or you made a mistake, like you're a bad person. So when students hear that, when children hear that over and over again, like whatever it is they're doing, like they're trying to learn and it's wrong, they internalize that they're a bad person. And for some students, it just ends up like some kids, they're just like, well, nothing I do is working. Clearly I can't learn. I can't change. Like, why would I even continue trying? You know, why would I even bother? It's not going to make a difference. And so they just give up. And it is a heartbreaking, sort of crushing thing. So this is the question that I had here. Like, these are sort of the things we've all talked about tonight. And the question that came up for me was really just like, what would change if we focused on relationship and development and learning? Like, what would change if those were the things that we were focusing on in school? And then this is the end of it. And we talked a little bit about, what can you do to address. Oh, awesome. All right. Well, clearly somebody is on their game. So I think this is a question for all of us to think about. Like, if we don't know our answer to this right now, like we talked a little bit about tonight, is like, how can what needs to happen for the school to be more interested in the sort of leakage of students into the criminal legal system? Like, how do we stop that leakage? Like, how do we even describe and find out like what's happening there? When students just sort of leak out of the school and nobody's responsible for them, the school sort of doesn't have any more responsibility for them, which I think is just, it just seems sort of mind-boggling to me that the schools are like, oh, they're not here anymore. Not a problem. DCYF can have them, foster care can have them, law enforcement can have them. They're not our problem anymore. That's great. Let's move on to the next high stakes testing. So, okay, we're already 5 minutes over. I'm just going to ask really quickly, any last minute thoughts or questions before we wrap up? Okay, well, thank you all so much. I appreciate everybody coming. I appreciate the conversation. You just made this a really, really wonderful experience, and I cannot say thank you enough times. So thank you to everybody who is on the call. Just really, really lovely.